My name is Cassidy Hale. I'm 32 years old. And 13 years ago, on the coldest November night Crestview, Montana had seen in decades, my father pointed at the front door and said 7 words I have never forgotten. You are not welcome in this house. I was 19. I had nowhere to go. The temperature outside was dropping below zero. And the reason he said it, the reason he believed I deserved to be thrown out into that storm, was a lie. A deliberate, carefully constructed lie told by my younger sister Lacey, who watched me walk out that door from the top of the staircase without saying a single word. 3 hours later, a woman found me collapsed on the side of Route 9, half frozen, barely conscious. She didn't know me. She owed me nothing. But she wrapped me in her coat, put me in her car, and made a decision that night that changed the entire course of my life. When my father found out who she was, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He could barely speak. Because the woman who saved me was someone even he couldn't dismiss, couldn't argue with, couldn't intimidate into silence. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you what happened when my father finally came face to face with the truth, let me take you back to where it all started. Because this story doesn't begin on that November night. It begins years earlier in a house where one daughter's tears were always worth more than the other's silence. If you've ever had your truth buried under someone else's lie, stay with me. This one's for you. And if stories like this are what you're here for, consider subscribing. I share these because I know someone out there needs to hear them. Now, let me take you back to Crestview. I grew up in a beige 2-story house on Alderman Road with parents who loved both their daughters. Or at least that's what they told themselves. My father, Robert Hale, was a contractor, broad-shouldered, quiet, the kind of man who thought decisiveness was the same thing as wisdom. My mother, Patricia, taught elementary school part-time and spent the rest of her energy managing the emotional weather of our household, which mostly meant managing Lacey. Lacey was 3 years younger than me. She was pretty in the way that made adults coo over her without her having to do anything at all. Big eyes, easy tears, a laugh that filled a room. People gravitated toward her naturally, and she knew it from a very young age. She understood, the way some children just do, that emotion was currency. That if she cried loud enough and long enough, the world would rearrange itself around her. I was different. I was the quiet one. The one with her nose in a textbook. The one who got good grades not because anyone pushed her but because she genuinely loved learning. I was 15 when I got my first academic award at Crestview High, a certificate for outstanding achievement in biology. I brought it home and set it on the kitchen table during dinner. My dad looked at it, nodded, said good job, and went back to his food. Lacey knocked her glass of juice over 30 seconds later, and the rest of dinner was about cleaning up the mess and calming her down because she felt bad about the accident. The certificate sat on the table untouched. I put it in my room that night and never brought home another one. That was the pattern. Not cruelty exactly. Just a consistent, quiet erasure. The kind you don't notice happening until you're deep inside it and your self-worth has been hollowed out like old wood. By the time I was 17, I had stopped expecting anything different. I studied hard, kept to myself, picked up a part-time job at a bookstore on Cedar Street to save money for college. I had a plan. Get out. Get a degree. Build something of my own far away from Alderman Road. 2 more years and I'd be free. But Lacey had other ideas. It started the summer before my senior year. I'd been accepted into a competitive pre-med pipeline program at a university 4 hours away. Full funding, 6 weeks, real lab experience. I was so excited I could barely sleep the night I got the acceptance email. I printed it out, walked downstairs, handed it to my dad at breakfast. He read it slowly. 6 weeks is a long time, he said. My mother asked who would help with Lacey's driving practice. And Lacey, 16 at the time, looked up from her phone and said, I thought we were doing the family trip to Glacier in July. We hadn't discussed a family trip to Glacier. There was no plan. But by that evening it had somehow become a real thing, a thing that mattered, a thing I would be ruining if I left for 6 weeks. I didn't go to the program. I spent the summer driving Lacey to her driving lessons. I told myself it was fine. College was coming. Everything would change. I started at Crestview Community College that fall, commuting from home to save money. It wasn't the dream, but it was a start. I was taking pre-med courses, maintaining a 4.0, working weekends at the bookstore. I was doing everything right. And for a while things were almost manageable. Lacey was in her junior year of high school, busy with her own social life, and our paths didn't cross much at home. Then Marcus came into the picture and everything unraveled. Marcus Greer was in my biology lab. He was pre-med too, smart and easy to talk to, the kind of person who made group projects bearable. We became friends first, genuinely just friends, studying together at the library on Thursday evenings, texting each other questions before exams. I didn't think much of it. Lacey saw him pick me up once when my car was in the shop and apparently that was enough. She developed an obsession with him that I didn't take seriously at first because Lacey developed obsessions the way other people developed colds. Frequently and without much logic. He found his social media. She started asking me questions about him, casual at first, then pointed. Does he have a girlfriend? Does he talk about me? Does he think I'm pretty? I told her gently that Marcus and I were just friends and that I wasn't going to involve him in whatever she was imagining. She went quiet after that. And I should have known by then that Lacey's silence was never peace. It was preparation. 2 weeks later, a Thursday, I came home from the library around 9 in the evening. Marcus and I had been studying for our midterm and I was tired and carrying a bag full of textbooks and I just wanted a shower and sleep. I walked through the front door and my father was standing in the living room with his arms crossed and a look on his face I had never seen before. Not anger exactly. Something colder. Betrayal. Lacey was on the couch, red-eyed, a crumpled tissue in her hand, my mother beside her with an arm around her shoulders. The scene was so perfectly arranged it should have had a director's credit. Sit down, my father said. I sat. Lacey looked up at me and for just a fraction of a second, before the tears started again, I saw something in her eyes that had nothing to do with sadness. Something precise. Calculated. Then it was gone and she was crying again, telling our parents through broken sobs that I had been spreading rumors about her at school, that I had told people she was unstable, that I had deliberately tried to humiliate her in front of Marcus by telling him she had been sending him messages pretending to be someone else. I sat there with my textbooks still in my bag and listened to my sister dismantle me with her mouth while her eyes stayed dry behind the tears. I told them none of it was true. I told them I had never said any of those things. I told them Lacey was upset about Marcus and that this was her way of dealing with it. My father looked at me like I had just confessed to something. My mother tightened her arm around Lacey. And then Lacey, still sniffling, pulled out her phone and showed them screenshots. Messages with my name on them. My profile photo. Words I had never typed sent to people I barely knew. Someone had made a fake account, mirrored my profile, and used it to send vicious messages about Lacey to half her friend group. I knew immediately who had done it. But knowing and proving are two entirely different things when the person you're accusing is already crying. My father didn't raise his voice. That was the thing about Robert Hale. He was most dangerous when he went quiet. He just looked at me with that cold, flat expression and told me that he didn't raise a daughter who tears her own sister apart out of jealousy. He said I had always resented Lacey. He said I had always made her feel like she wasn't good enough. And then he said the thing that broke something open inside my chest. He said, I don't know who you are anymore, Cassidy. And I don't think you should be under this roof tonight. My mother said nothing. She just held Lacey tighter. Outside the wind had picked up. The first real storm of November was rolling in off the mountains, the kind that Crestview braced for every year, the kind that emptied the roads and kept people locked indoors. I looked at my father and I asked him if he was serious. He walked to the front door and opened it. The cold came rushing in like it had been waiting. I picked up my bag. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the strap. I walked out. The door closed behind me. And Crestview, Montana swallowed me whole. The cold hit me like a wall the second that door closed. Not the kind of cold you complain about when you forget your scarf. This was the kind that gets inside your bones and stays there, the kind that makes your face ache and your fingers go numb before you've even made it to the end of the driveway. I stood on the front porch for maybe 10 seconds, staring at the street, waiting for the door to open again. Waiting for my father to come after me, to say he'd overreacted, to say come back inside, we'll figure this out in the morning. The door stayed closed. The porch light clicked off. I stepped off the porch and started walking. I had $32 in my wallet, my phone at 40% battery, and a backpack full of biology textbooks that felt heavier with every step. I had no plan. I just walked because standing still felt worse. The wind was coming down from the mountains in long, brutal gusts that pushed against me like something alive. The streets of Crestview were already empty. Nobody drives in a Montana November storm if they don't have to. I passed the gas station on Alderman Road, closed. I passed the diner on 5th, lights off, chairs up. I tried calling my friend Dana 3 times. Straight to voicemail each time. Her family had gone to visit her grandmother in Billings for the week. I remembered that too late. I thought about Marcus for a moment. Considered calling him. But how do you explain to someone you've known for 8 weeks that your father just threw you out of the house because your sister fabricated an entire digital identity to frame you? I couldn't form the words. I kept walking. The temperature had dropped to somewhere around 12 degrees by the time I made it to the end of Ridgeline Road. I know that now because I looked it up later, the weather data from that specific night. At the time I just knew that my lips had stopped feeling like lips and my ears were burning in the way that means they're past cold and into something more serious. I had a hoodie under my jacket, but the jacket was a fall jacket, the kind that works fine in October but has no business being outside in a November storm in Montana. I hadn't grabbed my real coat. There hadn't been time. There hadn't been a chance to think. I made it to the Route 9 underpass and sat down against the concrete wall, pulling my knees to my chest trying to generate some heat. The wind couldn't reach me there, but the cold was already inside me, and sitting still only made it worse. I checked my phone. Dana, still nothing. I tried my cousin Bet in Missoula, who I hadn't spoken to in over a year. No answer. I stared at my mother's contact name for a long time. I didn't call. He had been sitting right there. She had watched my father open that door, and she had kept her arm around Lacey and said absolutely nothing. I think that was the part that broke me more than anything my father said. Not the accusation. Not the door being opened. It was my mother's silence. The specific silence of someone who has a choice and makes it right in front of you. I don't know how long I sat under that underpass. Long enough that my hands stopped shaking and went still, which I would later learn is not a good sign. Long enough that I stopped feeling the cold as sharply, which is also not a good sign. I was 19 years old and I was sitting under a concrete overpass on Route 9 in a November storm with $32 and a bag of biology textbooks, and I was so tired. Not just physically. The kind of tired that settles somewhere deeper than muscle. The kind that comes from spending years being the invisible daughter in a house where someone else's tears always counted more than your truth. I remember thinking very clearly, in that strange calm that comes when your body is too cold to panic, that I had done everything right. I had gotten the grades. I had worked the job. I had bitten my tongue 1,000 times when Lacey took things from me, lied about things, rearranged reality to suit whatever story she needed that week. I had been the bigger person so many times that I had shrunk myself down to almost nothing. And it still wasn't enough. My father still believed her. My mother still chose her. And I was still here under a bridge in a storm alone. I pushed myself upright. Staying still was going to kill me. That wasn't dramatic thinking. That was biology, which I happened to know something about. Hypothermia doesn't announce itself. It just quietly takes over. I needed to keep moving. I made it about a quarter mile down Route 9 before my legs stopped cooperating the way I needed them to. I wasn't falling exactly, more like drifting toward the shoulder of the road, losing the thread of where the pavement ended and the gravel began. My vision had narrowed at the edges in a way I didn't have the clarity left to be frightened about. I remember headlights. I remember the sound of a car slowing down, gravel crunching, a door opening. I remember a voice, sharp and clear, cutting through the noise in my head like something solid. Hey, can you hear me? Don't sit down, stay up, look at me. I looked. A woman, somewhere in her late 40s, dark coat, short silver-streaked hair, flashlight in her hand. She had pulled her car half off the road with the hazards going. She was already reaching for me, both hands on my arms, steadying me. "What's your name?" she said. "Cassidy. Cassidy, I'm Dr. Vera Lund. I need you to stay awake and talk to me. Can you do that?" I said I thought so. She was already guiding me toward the passenger side of her car, one hand firm on my back, moving fast but not panicked. The kind of calm that comes from someone who has handled emergencies before and knows that panic is a waste of time. She got me into the seat, cranked the heat, pressed a travel blanket from her back seat around my shoulders. He kept talking to me, asking simple questions: my name, what year it was, where I lived. I answered all of them. He was checking my coherence. I understood that even then. "How long were you out there?" she asked, pulling back onto Route 9. "I don't know. A few hours maybe." "Where were you going?" I opened my mouth and nothing came out for a moment. Where was I going? I had not been going anywhere. I had just been going away. "I don't know," I said finally. "I got kicked out." She didn't say anything for a moment. Just drove, heat blasting, eyes on the road. Then quietly, tonight. In this weather. Yes. Another pause. Family. It wasn't really a question. Hi, father, I said. He believed my sister over me. She lied about something and he believed her and he told me to leave. Dr. Vera Lund said nothing for a long stretch of road. I watched the headlights carve through the dark and the snow that had started coming down in the last hour, soft and relentless. Then she said, I'm taking you somewhere warm. We're going to get you checked out and then we're going to figure out what comes next. Okay. I said okay. I didn't have the energy to argue, and even if I had, something in her voice made arguing feel beside the point. She wasn't asking permission exactly. She was telling me that someone had decided to be competent on my behalf for the next little while and that I could rest. She took me to Crestview General. Not the emergency entrance, but she knew people clearly because within 10 minutes of walking through a side door I was in a warm room with a blood pressure cuff on my arm and a nurse checking my fingers and ears for frostbite. Mild hypothermia, the doctor on call said. Lucky. Another hour out there and the conversation would have been different. Dr. Vera Lund sat in the chair by the door the entire time. She answered the nurse's questions clearly and efficiently, explained where she'd found me, the road conditions, how I'd presented. She had the focused economy of someone very used to medical environments. I would learn why later. When the immediate checks were done and I had hot broth in my hands and feeling had returned to all my fingers, I looked at her properly for the first time. She was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not pity. Something more steady than pity. You said Dr. Lund, I said. What kind of doctor? Cardiothoracic surgeon, she said. I'm chief of surgery at Crestview General. I was driving back from a conference in Bozeman when I found you. I stared at her. Chief of surgery. She had stopped her car on Route 9 in a snowstorm for a 19-year-old girl sitting on the shoulder of the road and had not once made me feel like an inconvenience or a burden or a problem to be managed. She had just handled it. She had just helped. Why, I said. Came out smaller than I intended. She looked at me evenly. Because you were there and you needed help and I was able to give it. That's the whole reason. I looked down at the cup in my hands. Something in my chest cracked open quietly, the way ice does when the temperature starts to shift. Not loudly. Just a slow, deep fracture spreading through something that had been frozen for a very long time. My parents don't know I'm here, I said. I know. Her voice was even, careful. Do you want them to? I thought about the door opening. About my mother's silence. About Lacey watching from the top of the stairs. No, I said. Not yet. Dr. Vera Lund nodded once, like that was a completely reasonable answer. Like she had already decided that whatever came next she was not going anywhere. And she didn't. My parents showed up at Crestview General at midnight. I don't know who called them. I suspect it was the hospital's standard protocol, a minor. Except I wasn't a minor anymore, I was 19, which complicated things in ways I didn't fully understand yet. What I do know is that I heard my father's voice in the hallway before I saw him, that familiar low authority he used when he wanted people to understand he was someone who mattered in a room. She's our daughter. We need to see her now. Dr. Vera Lund was still in the chair by the door. She stood up slowly, unhurried, and stepped into the hallway before my parents could reach the room. I could hear everything through the thin partition wall. Mr. and Mrs. Hale. Vera's voice was completely level. I'm Dr. Vera Lund, chief of surgery here. I'm the one who found your daughter on Route 9 tonight. Pause. My father's voice shifted slightly, recalibrated. We appreciate that. We'd like to see her. I'm sure you would. Can I ask you something first? It wasn't framed as a request. Your daughter is 19 years old. The temperature tonight dropped to 12 degrees. She was found on the shoulder of a highway showing early signs of hypothermia with $32 and a bag of textbooks. Can you help me understand what happened? My mother's voice, thin and defensive. There was a family situation. It got out of hand. Out of hand, Vera repeated. She had a way of repeating phrases back that made them land differently, heavier, like she was holding them up to the light so everyone could see exactly what they were made of. Your daughter told me she was asked to leave. She wasn't asked. My father started. It was more of a... She was told to leave, Vera said. In a Montana November storm. With no coat, no plan, and nowhere to go. I want to make sure I have the facts right before we continue this conversation. Silence. The particular silence of two people who are used to being the most important voices in a room suddenly realizing they are not. I lay in that hospital bed and felt something shift inside me. Not relief exactly. Something quieter. The sensation of watching someone finally say out loud the thing that had lived in my chest for years without a name. They came in eventually. My father filled the doorway the way he always did, broad and certain, except he wasn't certain right now. His eyes went to me on the bed and something moved across his face I had never seen there before. Not guilt, not yet. More like the beginning of the realization that guilt was coming and there was nowhere to outrun it. My mother came in behind him and when she saw me she made a sound low in her throat that she quickly swallowed. Lacey wasn't with them. I noticed that immediately. Cassidy, my father said. You gave us a scare. I looked at him. I didn't say anything. We came as soon as the hospital called, my mother said. Not as soon as they'd looked out the window and thought about the temperature. Not as soon as they realized I'd been gone too long. As soon as the hospital called. I filed that away quietly. Dr. Vera Lund stood just inside the doorway. She didn't leave. She didn't pretend to be busy with something else. She simply stood there, present, witness, and my parents could not make her invisible no matter how many times my father's eyes flicked in her direction. We should talk about getting you home, my mother said gently. I'm not going home, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. My father's jaw tightened. Cassidy, this is not the time. You opened the door, I said. You pointed at it. You told me I shouldn't be under your roof. Nothing has changed since then except that I ended up in a hospital, which is a pretty predictable outcome of what you did. The room was very quiet. My mother looked at her hands. My father looked at the wall above my head, the way people do when they cannot face the thing directly in front of them. Madison told us some things, he said finally. We reacted badly. We can acknowledge that. She lied, I said. She has been lying about me for years and you have been choosing to believe her for years and tonight you threw me out of the house in a storm over another lie. That is what happened. That is the whole story. Robert. Vera's voice from the doorway was quiet but it stopped him completely. I think what your daughter needs right now is rest. And I think what this situation needs is time and clarity, not a conversation at 1 a.m. in an emergency ward. My father looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. The specific discomfort of a man who is used to being the authority in a room and has just encountered someone who outranks him not through aggression but through an absolute composure he doesn't know how to compete with. We'll come back in the morning, he said stiffly. They left. Vera came and sat back in her chair. She picked up the medical journal she'd been reading and opened it without commentary. Like what had just happened was simply a thing that had needed doing and was now done. I was discharged the next afternoon. My parents did not come back that morning. Vera was there when I woke up. She'd brought breakfast from the cafeteria and asked me without preamble what I wanted to do next. I told her I didn't know. I had a bookstore job and a 4.0 and nowhere to sleep that night. She nodded like this was a logistical problem rather than a catastrophe. I have a spare room, she said. It's yours if you want it. No conditions, no timeline, just a room with a door that locks and a kitchen that's stocked. I stared at her. You don't know me. I know enough, she said. I know you were out in a 12-degree storm with biology textbooks and $32 because you refused to stop existing just because someone told you to. That tells me quite a bit. I moved in that Saturday. Everything I owned fit into 2 bags in the back of Vera's car, which was a quiet, devastating kind of fact I chose not to sit with for too long. Her house was on Clearwater Drive, a 10-minute drive from the hospital, a 2-story with high ceilings and bookshelves lining every hallway. It smelled like coffee and old paper and something faintly antiseptic that I would later realize was simply her, the way surgeons sometimes carry the hospital home without knowing it. The spare room was at the end of the upstairs hall. It had a window that looked out over the backyard and a desk beneath it and a bed with clean white sheets. I sat on the edge of that bed for a long time after Vera left me to settle, just listening to the house around me. No one was going to knock on that door and accuse me of something. No one was going to cry strategically in the next room. No one was going to look at me with that particular exhausted disappointment that had been my father's default expression for as long as I could remember. The arrangement shifted gradually into something neither of us had a word for. Vera didn't hover. She didn't make my presence a project or treat me like a cause. She simply included me. Dinner at 7 if she wasn't on call. Coffee in the kitchen on Saturday mornings. Occasionally she'd leave a book on the hallway table outside my room with a post-it that said something like relevant to your coursework, or you'll argue with this one, good practice. She was right on both counts every single time. I went back to Crestview Community College that Monday. Sat in my biology lecture, took notes, answered questions, stayed after to confirm my lab schedule. I kept my job at the bookstore. I told no one what had happened. What was different now was that I went home to Clearwater Drive in the evenings. To a house where no one was waiting to need something from me, to accuse me of something, to require me to be smaller than I was. That difference was enormous in ways I didn't have language for yet. My parents called twice that first week. My father's voicemail was formal, an invitation to come home and discuss things as a family. My mother's was softer, more uncertain. I saved both and returned neither. Lacey didn't call at all. I noticed that too. 3 weeks in, Vera knocked on my door one evening and asked if she could come in. She sat in the chair by the window and looked at me with that steady directness I had come to recognize as her version of seriousness. "Are you okay?" she said. Honestly. I thought about it properly, the way she had modeled without ever explicitly teaching. The habit of not reaching for the automatic answer. "I think I'm becoming okay," I said. "I'm not there yet, but I can see the direction." She nodded. Like that was exactly the right answer. "Good," she said. "That's enough for now." She stood, paused at the door. "Your lab scores came back. You got the highest mark in the cohort." She said it the way she said most things, evenly, factually, as if it were simply a piece of information the world needed to have. Then she was gone. I sat at the desk by the window for a long time after that, looking out at the backyard where November snow was collecting in the corners. Somewhere across Crestview, in a beige 2-story house on Alderman Road, my family was having dinner without me. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, that thought did not hurt. It was just a fact. A fact that was getting smaller every day. I opened my biology textbook. I started to study. I did not look back. The next 3 years moved the way recovery moves. Not in a straight line, not in a clean upward arc, but in something more honest than that. 2 steps forward, 1 step sideways, an occasional full stop where I'd sit at the desk by the window on Clearwater Drive and have to remind myself that where I was now was not where I had been. That the door at the end of the hall was mine. That no one in this house was keeping score against me. I transferred to the University of Montana in Missoula at the end of my second year at Crestview Community College. Full academic scholarship, pre-med track. The kind of opportunity one had been quietly building toward since I was 15 years old, holding a biology ribbon that no one in my house had bothered to look at. Vera drove me up herself the morning of move-in, helped me carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs, and stood in the parking lot afterward with the car keys in her hand and that familiar, even expression. "Call me if you need anything," she said. "Not just if something goes wrong. If anything happens, good or bad, call me." I said I would. I meant it completely, and I kept that promise every Sunday for the next 4 years. University was the first place I had ever existed without a before attached to me. Nobody there knew about Alderman Road or November storms or a sister who had constructed my guilt out of screenshots and borrowed tears. I was just Cassidy Hale, pre-med, quietly competitive, the one in the front row who asked the questions that made professors pause before answering. I liked who I was in that building. I liked that I had built her from scratch without anyone's help or permission. I called Vera every Sunday without exception. We talked about my coursework, about interesting cases at the hospital, about books we had both been reading. The calls lasted anywhere from 15 minutes to 2 hours depending on what either of us had going on. She never pushed for more than I offered, and I found that over time I was offering more and more, filling in the gaps of my own story that I hadn't been ready to speak out loud before that year. The night on Route 9. The years before it, each one a smaller version of the same pattern. The specific, grinding exhaustion of being the daughter who was always asked to be the bigger person until there was almost nothing left of her. Vera listened the way surgeons listen. With complete attention, no interruption, processing fully before responding. When I told her about the summer I gave up the pre-med pipeline program for Lacey's driving lessons, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That cost you more than a summer. You understand that?" It wasn't a question, and it wasn't sympathy exactly. It was something more precise than sympathy, an acknowledgement, the first real one anyone had ever given me for that particular loss. I hadn't known how badly I needed someone to say it until the words were already in the air between us. I heard about my family in pieces, the way you hear about people you've left behind. My father's contracting business was expanding. My mother had moved to full-time teaching. Lacey had started college in Bozeman and documented every moment of it, the kind of constant posting that reads less like sharing and more like argument. A photo of the three of them at a restaurant, wine glasses raised, caption reading, "The only people I'll ever need." No mention of a sister anywhere on her page. No gap in the frame where someone should have been. I had been erased so thoroughly that I started to wonder, in an almost academic way, whether she had genuinely convinced herself I never existed. I closed the app and did not open it again for 6 months. Then in the spring of my junior year something happened that changed the direction of everything. A professor named Dr. Anita Reyes taught my healthcare policy seminar. Sharp, demanding, the kind of academic who treated intellectual laziness as a personal affront. I respected her immediately. Midway through the semester she called me into her office and told me she was nominating me for a regional student research fellowship focused on healthcare access disparities in rural Montana communities. The fellowship came with a stipend, a faculty mentor, and a public presentation at a statewide medical conference in Billings at year's end. I almost declined out of reflex. Not because I didn't want it, because wanting things had been dangerous for so long that holding opportunity at arm's length was still my first instinct. Old habits die slowly when they kept you safe for years. I called Vera that night and laid out the entire situation. She listened until I finished and then said without hesitation, "Cassidy, if you don't take this fellowship I will be genuinely annoyed with you." I laughed, actually laughed, which surprised me. It was the closest she had ever come to pushing me directly, and it was exactly the right amount of push at exactly the right moment. I sent my acceptance email the following morning before I could talk myself out of it. I spent the next 6 months conducting research across rural Montana, interviewing patients who drove 90 miles for basic care, clinic administrators running underfunded facilities, county health officials holding systems together with too little of everything. I was good at it in ways that surprised me. Not just the analytical work but the human part, sitting across from someone and asking them to describe the specific moments the system had left them without options. I had some personal understanding of that feeling. It turned out that understanding was its own kind of qualification. The statewide conference was held in Billings in November. Exactly 3 years after the night on Route 9. I had not planned that symmetry and I did not think it meant anything in particular. I just noticed it the way you notice a strange coincidence, and then I kept moving. I presented to a room of 200 professionals and academics. I was 22 years old, 35 minutes, no notes. Dr. Reyes was in the 3rd row. Vera had driven 4 hours from Crestview and was in the 2nd row without having said a word to me about it. I spotted her face 30 seconds before I walked up. I very nearly lost my composure. I held it together by reminding myself that falling apart at the podium was not something Vera Lund would consider acceptable. After the presentation, Dr. Reyes introduced me to Sandra Okafor, director of Bridge Health Montana, a nonprofit expanding medical access across underserved rural communities in the state. Sandra asked me within 4 minutes of meeting me what I intended to do after medical school. I told her I wanted to build something. I didn't have the full shape yet, but it was connected to the people I'd spent 6 months interviewing, the ones who delayed care until it became crisis because there was no closer option. I wanted to close that distance in a way that outlasted any single grant cycle. Sandra looked at me for a moment after I finished. Then she reached into her bag, produced a business card and held it out. "Call me when you graduate," she said. "I am not being polite. I genuinely mean that." I graduated the following May, summa cum laude. Vera was at the ceremony in a green blazer, standing in the crowd with a look on her face that proud was too small a word for. Something closer to vindicated, the expression of someone who placed a careful bet on a person a long time ago and just watched it pay off beyond every expectation. Medical school acceptance letters came in March. 3 programs responded. The strongest was from a school in Seattle with a concentration in rural and community health. So precisely aligned with everything I had been building that I read the acceptance email 3 times before I believed it was addressed to me. I did not call my parents. I did not call Lacey. My life had stopped requiring their acknowledgement somewhere in the last 4 years, and I found that the absence of that old hunger felt less like loss and more like space. Room to breathe without bracing for the next revision of the story. What I didn't know as I packed my apartment was that Lacey had spent much of the past year coming quietly apart. Not dramatically, not loudly, just in the slow way people unravel when they've pressed hard against a version of events that isn't true. A lie had collapsed in front of people she trusted, something separate from what she'd done to me but structurally identical. The details came through a mutual acquaintance in a message I hadn't asked for and almost didn't read. I read it once, set my phone down and went back to packing. I didn't feel satisfaction or vindication. Just something flat and tired. A recognition I had been carrying for years without a proper name for it. The truth has a long memory. It simply waits for the moment the weight of what someone has built on top of it finally becomes more than they can hold. I moved to Seattle in August and started medical school the following September. Vera sent me a single text the morning of my first day. Don't forget where you came from. It is the best clinical training you have. I read it on the bus to campus and carried it with me all day like a compass point. Something fixed to orient by when everything else around me was new and uncertain and slightly overwhelming. For the first time in my life I had the quiet, solid satisfaction of being exactly where I was supposed to be. Not despite what had happened on Alderman Road and Route 9 and all the years in between. Because of every single piece of it. What I could not have known yet was that Crestview had one more thing to say to me. That my parents and Lacey and the unresolved weight of that November night were going to find their way back into my life through a door I hadn't anticipated. The reckoning I had believed I left behind in a hospital ward at 1 a.m. was still making its quiet way toward me. It always takes longer than you expect. And it always arrives at exactly the moment it was always going to. The call came on a Tuesday in March, 2 years into medical school, at 7:40 in the morning while I was eating toast over my kitchen sink and reviewing cardiology notes on my laptop. I almost didn't answer. The number was a Montana area code but not one I recognized, and I had a pathophysiology session starting at 9 that I could not afford to walk into underprepared. I answered anyway. Something about it felt deliberate. It was my mother. Not my father calling on her behalf the way he sometimes had in the early voicemails, the ones I had never returned. Patricia Hale herself, voice smaller than I remembered, like the years had taken something structural out of it. Cassidy, she said. I know you don't want to hear from me. I know I don't have any right to ask you for anything. But I need you to know something and I didn't want you to find out from someone else. I set down my toast. What happened? Your father had a heart attack. Last Thursday. He's stable now, he's home, but it was serious. They're saying he needs to make significant changes or the next one will be worse. Pause. I thought you should know. I stood in my kitchen in Seattle and said nothing for a long moment. My father had had a heart attack. Robert Hale, who had stood at his own front door in a Montana November and opened it with his jaw set and his eyes flat, who had believed a staged performance over my 4 years of truth without hesitation, was now stable and home, and my mother was calling to make sure I heard it from her. I'm glad he's stable, I said finally. Thank you for telling me. Another pause. Longer. That's all. She wasn't being accusatory. She sounded genuinely uncertain, like she didn't know what she had expected but hadn't expected that. What else would you like me to say, Mom? She didn't answer that. Instead she said, Lacey is home. She's been here since Friday. She's not doing well, Cassidy. She hasn't been doing well for a while. Her voice thinned further. I don't expect you to care about that. I just thought you should have the full picture. I thanked her again and said I had to get to class and ended the call and stood at the kitchen window for another few minutes without moving. Then I closed my cardiology notes, opened a different tab, and looked up the clinical profile for the type of cardiac event my mother had described. Old habits. When I didn't know what to feel, I defaulted to what I knew how to do, which was think clearly and gather information and not fall apart in the kitchen before 9 in the morning. I called Vera at noon between sessions. Told her everything my mother had said, the heart attack, Lacey coming home, the quality of my mother's voice on the line. Vera listened without interrupting. How do you feel? She said when I finished. I don't know yet, I said. I think I'm waiting to find out. That's honest. Pause. Do you want to go back? No. The answer came quickly, more quickly than I expected. No. There's nothing there I need to fix and nothing I broke. I'm not going back to manage their feelings about what they did. Good, Vera said. Straightforward, no editorializing. Good. Keep going. Call me tonight if you need to. Kept going. I did not contact my father. I did not reach out to Lacey. I sent my mother a single text 2 weeks later. I hope Dad's recovery is going well, and left it at that. She responded with a thank you and a string of words that started to edge toward more, and I did not reply to those. Medical school had become the most consuming and clarifying experience of my life. The days were long and left very little room for anything that wasn't directly in front of me, which was exactly what I needed. Not as avoidance. As architecture. I was building something inside those long days, a version of myself that had nothing to do with Alderman Road and everything to do with the choices I had made since Route 9. I was good at the clinical work. Not just technically but at what happened in the room with the patient. Reading what was unsaid, understanding that a person in a hospital gown is almost never only worried about the thing they came in for. I had been in that position. I knew how it felt to be uncertain whether the person in front of you actually saw you or was just processing your chart. I tried to be the other kind of doctor. I graduated from medical school the following spring with a residency placement in family medicine at a Seattle hospital, specifically selected for its rural outreach program. Sandra Okafor sent me a congratulations card, handwritten, which I hadn't expected, with a line at the bottom that said, "The offer still stands, Dr. Hale." I read it twice and put it on the windowsill above my desk where I could see it every morning. I was 28 years old and I had a medical degree and a residency and a real, solid future built on ground I had laid myself. The girl who had walked out of a house on Alderman Road with $32 and a bag of textbooks was still inside me somewhere. I hadn't lost her, didn't want to, but she was not the only thing I was anymore. 3 months into my residency, a letter arrived at my apartment. Not an email. An actual physical letter, handwritten on plain white paper, postmarked Bozeman. Lacey's handwriting on the envelope. I recognized it even after all the years, the slightly cramped capital letters, the way she formed her H's. I held it for a while before I opened it. Inside she had written 4 pages. Front and back. I won't reproduce all of it here because some of it was too raw to repeat and some of it was simply not mine to share. But the substance of it was this. She had been in therapy for 14 months. Her therapist had strongly encouraged her to write the letter as part of her process, with the explicit understanding that I owed her no response and that the letter was for my information, not my obligation. She had framed it that way herself, which told me the therapy was doing something real. She wrote about the night she fabricated the fake account. The screenshots. The bruise she had pressed deliberately into her own arm so it would look convincing. She wrote that she had known even as she was doing it that things had gone further than intended. She had expected our parents to restrict my phone, not open the front door in a snowstorm. When she watched me walk down the driveway and disappear into the dark, she had felt something she still couldn't name properly, somewhere between horror and a terrible relief she was ashamed of even now. She wrote that she had told people I was dead because the alternative, explaining what she had actually done, was something she hadn't been equipped to face. That the lie had grown in the way lies do when you keep feeding them, until she was trapped inside a version of her own life that required constant maintenance and left her with no one she could be honest with, including herself. She did not ask for forgiveness in the letter. She said very specifically that she was not asking for that and that her therapist had told her she needed to be clear about it. She was asking me to know the truth from her mouth, in her words, without the filter of time or distance or the story she had told everyone else. That was all. I read all 4 pages twice. Then I folded the letter and put it in the drawer of my nightstand and did not take it out again for 3 weeks. When I took it out again I read it a 3rd time. Something had shifted in those 3 weeks. Not toward reconciliation, not toward warmth, but toward clarity. The letter hadn't given me back the pre-med summer or the years of invisibility or the night on Route 9. But it had made Lacey legible to me in a way she hadn't been before. Not sympathetic. Just human. A person who had made terrible choices for comprehensible reasons, now living in the wreckage of those choices the same way I had lived in mine, just from a different side. I wrote back. 1 page. Not warm, not cruel, just honest. I told her I had read the letter. I told her the therapy was clearly working and she should keep going. I told her I forgave her in the way forgiveness actually functions, not as a restoration of trust or an invitation back into my life, but as a private act of release, putting down a weight I no longer needed to carry. I wished her well and told her the correspondence ended here. She did not write back. I had not expected her to. I had been clear and she had heard it, and that was the whole of it. I folded my copy of the letter, put it back in the drawer, and went to the hospital. I had patients to see. People sitting in rooms in hospital gowns carrying things that were too heavy for them, hoping the person who walked through the door was the kind who actually saw them. That was what I was there for. That was the whole point. Vera called that evening. I told her about the letter. She listened without interruption. "How do you feel?" she said. "Like I finally set something down," I said. "Something I didn't realize I was still holding." "Good," she said. Then, because she was Vera, she asked about my most interesting case of the day, and we talked about medicine for an hour, and I slept without difficulty for the first time in longer than I could remember. That was not the end of the story. But it was the end of the part that had been unfinished. The part that had been waiting since a November night on Route 9 for someone to finally say what had actually happened, out loud, in writing, without excuses. It had taken 13 years and 4 handwritten pages, but it had arrived. The rest I was still building. 5 years is a long time. Long enough for a residency to become a career. Long enough for a city to stop feeling foreign and start feeling like yours. Long enough for the person you were at 19 to become someone you remember clearly but no longer live inside. I was 32 years old. I had been a practicing physician for 3 years, working out of a family medicine clinic in Seattle with a satellite program running mobile health units into rural communities twice a month. Sandra Okafor and I had built it together. Bridge Health Montana had expanded into a partnership with 4 clinics across 2 states, and our rural outreach model was being studied by a health policy institute in Washington, D.C. as a replicable framework for underserved regions nationally. Vera had framed the journal article about it and hung it in her office at Crestview General without telling me. I had a life. A full one. An apartment with good light and too many books. A colleague named Priya who had become one of my closest friends and who made me laugh harder than almost anyone. A therapist I saw every other Thursday who had helped me understand over 2 years of careful work that the survival instincts that kept me functional through the worst of it were not the same tools I needed now. That I could put some of them down. I had not spoken to my parents in 5 years. Not since the single text to my mother during my father's recovery. They still sent Christmas cards. I knew this because they arrived every December like clockwork, Robert and Patricia in the return address corner, no message inside beyond their signatures. I kept them in a shoebox on the top shelf of my closet. Not sentiment. More like documentation. Evidence that the distance was mutual and deliberate and survived by everyone involved. Then in October my father called. Not a voicemail. An actual call that I happened to pick up because I was half asleep on a Sunday morning and grabbed my phone without looking at the screen. His voice when I said hello was different from how I remembered it. Older. Something abraded out of it like wood that has been sanded down to its grain. "Cassidy," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd answer." "I wasn't sure I would either," I said. A long pause. Outside my window Seattle was doing its October thing. Rain on the glass, the city muffled and gray. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for 5 years," he said. "I haven't gotten there yet. But I wanted you to know something. Your mother and I, we know what Lacey did. The whole of it. Not just that she lied. The account, the bruise, all of it. She told us herself 2 years ago. Sat us down and told us everything." I said nothing. "I'm not calling to ask you for anything," he said quickly as if he had rehearsed this part. "I'm not asking you to forgive us or come home or pretend any of this is fixable. I know it isn't. I needed you to know that we know. That we understand what we did. That I understand what I did." His voice broke slightly on the last word, just a fracture quickly controlled. "You were telling the truth. You were always telling the truth and I chose not to hear it and I am sorrier for that than I have words for." I sat with that for a moment. The rain on the window. The coffee maker doing its thing in the kitchen. My father's voice on the phone, smaller than it had ever been, carrying something I had waited 13 years to hear and had genuinely stopped expecting would ever arrive. "I know," I said finally. "Thank you for saying it." Another pause. "How are you?" he said. "I mean that. I'm not asking to get back in. How are you, Cassidy?" So I told him. Not everything, not the whole architecture of the life I had built. That felt like too much too soon. But I told him I was a doctor. I told him about the rural outreach program in Sandra and the policy work. I told him I was well. That I had people who mattered to me. That I was, in the most genuine sense of the word, okay. He listened without interrupting. When I finished he said very quietly, "We should have seen that in you. All of it was already there. We were looking in the wrong direction." "Yes," I said. "You were." We talked for 22 minutes. Not warm, not reconciled, not a reunion. Just two people who had hurt and been hurt speaking to each other in plain language for the first time. It was smaller than the conversation I had spent years imagining. And also, in some way I hadn't anticipated, more real. I called Vera immediately after. She picked up on the second ring. My father called, I said. I know, she said. He called me first. Asked if I thought you'd want to hear from him. I told him that was your decision and gave him nothing else. A beat. I hope that was right. It was, I said. How do you feel? I looked out the window at the Seattle rain. I thought about a 19-year-old on Route 9 in the dark, moving toward nothing, refusing to stop. I thought about a hospital room and a woman in a chair by the door who had decided, for reasons both simple and enormous, to stay. I thought about 13 years of building something from the rubble of that night. The fellowship and the medical degree and the outreach program and every patient who had sat across from me carrying something too heavy, and the fact that I had known each time how to be present for them because I had once been on the other side of that equation. I feel like it's over, I said. Not fixed. Just over. Like the last piece of something finally landed where it was always going to land. Vera was quiet for a moment. That's enough, she said. That's more than enough. I went to Crestview for Christmas that year for the first time in 13 years. Not to Alderman Road. To Vera's house on Clearwater Drive where I had my own room still. She had never repurposed it, a fact she mentioned only once and without drama. We cooked together on Christmas Eve, made a mess of the kitchen, drank wine and talked for hours. On Christmas morning I drove past Alderman Road. Not to stop. Not to knock. Just to look at the beige two-story, the windows lit from inside, and to register that it was still there. That I was still here. That both things were true simultaneously and neither one determined the other anymore. My mother had sent a card that year with a note inside. Short, careful, every word chosen deliberately. We are so proud of what you have built. We have no right to say that and we know it. But it is true. Signed by both of them. I put it with the others in the shoebox. Then I took it back out and set it on the windowsill in my old room. Not forgiveness. Not a door reopened. Just an acknowledgement that something had shifted, that the weight had changed, that I was holding it differently now. Vera found me standing at the window looking out at the snow on Clearwater Drive. She handed me a cup of coffee and stood beside me without speaking. That was one of the things I had learned from her over 13 years. That presence does not always require words. That sometimes the most meaningful thing one person can do for another is simply stand beside them and let the silence be enough. Merry Christmas, Vera, I said. Merry Christmas, Cassidy, she said. We stood at the window together and watched the snow come down over Crestview, over the town that had tried to swallow me whole 13 years ago and had instead, without knowing it, pointed me toward everything I was ever going to become. I was 32 years old. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I was not becoming anything. I had arrived. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told. And here on Confira Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.